The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar Uncovering E-Learning Best Practices from a CSTD Award-Winning Project. My name is Sarah and I will be helping out with today's presentation. Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in the session. This webinar is being recorded. We will provide you a link to the recording as soon as it is available. You have joined today's webinar listening through your computer speaker system by default. If you would like to listen using your phone, just locate your audio pane and select Use Telephone. The dial-in information and access code will then be displayed. Attendees will be in listen-only mode, and we invite you to ask questions about the presentation using the Questions pane. Simply type in your question and click Send. At the end of the webinar, we will do a Q&A and take as many questions as possible. Now let me introduce you to our presenters. Anne Schuler is currently employed by Workforce Development, Human Resources, and the Government of Alberta Human Services Ministry as a Learning and Development Consultant. Anne has a background in HR, complemented by over a decade of experience working in the field of adult education. Anne's experience in researching and utilizing various adult learning models and tools serves her well as she supports WFD's learning management system and exploration into alternative delivery modes. Kevin Kernahan is a Senior Production Manager at Global Knowledge with expertise across all fields of e-learning development. Kevin has an extensive career in the e-learning industry in Canada, where he has served in the role of developer, team lead, and instructional designer. Thank you so much for being here. And Kevin, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Well, firstly, I just want to thank absolutely everyone for being able to join us today. What we're going to do is we're going to actually have a little walkthrough. We're going to get the screen set up shortly to walk you through our presentation, and we're going to try and get straight to the actual program demonstration in a timely fashion. We're just going to set up the screen, so if you could just wait one moment. Okay. So right now, we're actually going to walk through what we have from a program perspective. We've got our presentation set up based on the ADDIE model, and we've thrown in an extra A, so it's ADDIE plus A with an adjust. We wanted to present the overall program based on all the different steps that both Alberta Human Services and Global Knowledge went through as a collective, two collective organizations. And because ADDIE is so well known in the system, we wanted to actually use that as a framework, but in all fairness, any collaborative evolutionary process can work, so we just have this as a general presentation model. Anne and I are going to be going back and forth. We're going to be talking about things that were, from her perspective, very valuable, or were also some challenges. We're going to talk about some things from Global Knowledge's perspective as a vendor on what were challenges, because we're talking about working at a distance here, and we'll walk through the entire program. So the very first area that we're going to be discussing is we're going to talk about the analysis that took place, and this actually started long before Global Knowledge was involved, and it actually started with Alberta Human Services. So I'm going to throw to my co-presenter, Anne Schuler, right now, and she's going to talk a little bit about the 3 bullets that we have here for the analysis that took place. We've got the business need, evaluation plan, and constraints and challenges. So I ask you to just welcome Anne aboard, and I'll throw it to her.
Good morning, everyone, and I echo Kevin's thank you for everyone joining us this morning. So from Government of Alberta, at that time we were Children Youth Services Ministry. Why was this important to us? From a business perspective, we looked at enhancing service standards and performance in the child intervention system and across the Children Youth Services Ministry. We needed there was strong support that existed to focus on developing critical thinking or reflective analysis skills separately, and ultimately we wanted to keep Albertans safe. We have the added component now with our Human Services Ministry of having occupational health, safety, and wellness as well being added, so that adds another element to why it's important to human services. We wanted staff to be able to make well-reasoned decisions and ultimately have well-reasoned outcomes. We looked at what our needs were and identified our gaps. And there was a world of work went into that because we have increasingly complex situations happening in our workforce. We looked at things like the Conference Board of Canada employability, thinking critically and acting logically to evaluate situations, solve problems, and make decisions, to see different points of view and evaluate them, to assess and apply specialized knowledge, to evaluate solutions, to make recommendations. The child intervention system was also under review, and they do reviews on a continuous basis for any situation that develops. And we had also looked at what their feedback was, and they had asked us to develop and implement an HR strategy that addressed capacity, qualifications, and competencies at all levels of the system. In 2009, there was a meeting with all of the CEOs in our 10 CFSAs in Alberta, and we asked them to identify essential areas of employee development that could contribute to the direction for the workforce development programs and priorities. And in 2009, they identified critical thinking as a top priority. So we had incredible support. Our HR 5-year workforce framework also supported enhanced critical thinking skills that will positively enrich worker performance. Our Director of Child, Youth, and Family Enhancement Act, who's the legal guardian for all children in care, was supporting the development of the tools and the resources and training, and identified that as being an assistance to workers in making complex decisions regarding the safety of children. Our Director of HR spoke of changing roles of HRCs into business partners and needed to have the HRCs, those are human resource consultants, sorry. We use many acronyms in the government. The HRCs had to have an increased capacity to deal with being business partners rather than just human resource consultants. And our Executive Director of Family Supports for Children with Disabilities also identified a need for their workers to have support in dealing with the complex challenges they had. And our own administrative staff within workforce development we were seeing the complexities of the work that they were doing and realizing that we just had an overall need for critical thinking. Then came the evaluations, and we had to figure out what would be the success criteria if we were to build this training and it was to be successful, what would be the measurements. So the success criteria were determined to be making well-reasoned decisions to achieve high service standards. In short, Albertans would be safe. Risk management and mitigation strategies included in well-reasoned decisions. We would develop training strategies and plans for enhancing and aligning training and critical thinking competencies. We would focus on multiple employee groups, increase engagement, and leverage training development. And we would enhance components of the department overall human resource management strategy to which would lead to raising service standards. We also identified what tools were being used now, what the next steps would be, and into the future. So we had competencies, we had qualifications and training, we had mandatory and optional. We did a gap analysis which showed us what we had and where we wanted to go and what the piece in the middle was, and that's what we were working on. We did interviews with department, so that's the main body of the government that works in Edmonton. We did interviews with the department, and we also went out and did focus groups so that we could collect information from the people who were going to be using this and what was it they really needed. We also did practice readiness assessments, did learning plans, looked at learning plans and what people were saying they needed. And we looked at what resources were already available and if there was anything out there robust enough that we could use. And the outcomes and end results were that documentation indicated that our workers and staff, the outcomes and the end results that would denote success were that the documentations that our staff would produce would indicate that the workers and staff were making well-reasoned decisions, and there was documented evidence to support those decisions. And that's really important when we go into things like we're in an investigation, or we just need to have a manager know that the frontline worker or the staff that they're involved with has looked at all aspects of making a well-informed decision. So some of the constraints and challenges we came up against, our audiences were not all of our employees are not doing the same job. They have diverse competencies and expected levels of competencies. Availability was a huge issue. We've got staff all over the province, and we also have staff who are in critical positions and they can't leave to go to training because they need someone to cover them. And as with many organizations these days, we have technology issues. We have a variety of computers all over Alberta at various stages of technology development.
Excellent. I mean, that's actually a really interesting point that you bring up, and when we talk about technology, because that has a direct result on what the developer has at their disposal for tools. One of the challenges that always comes into play when we're doing the front-end work involved in a custom e-learning program is understanding the environment that the program is going to be deployed inside of. Many times, a lot of individuals, they see fantastic things on their great high-speed internet at home, and there's beautiful interactivity and great presentations, and it's very marketing-driven. But a lot of the times, the technology inside of an organization is much more constricted and has different characteristics or different requirements that don't necessarily allow what people see in their personal or in their marketing environments take place inside of a business environment, so to speak. So, I mean, it's an interesting bridge that we've clearly identified that as a constraint and challenge right at the very beginning.
Absolutely.
So right now we're going to talk a little bit about we're moving on to the design phase of the actual development process, and this is actually a little bit where we start to get involved as an overall developer. Obviously, you can see there was a lot of foresight and thought that took place long before the developer, that being Global Knowledge, was chosen to actually move forward. So the very first thing that we actually have when we go through the overall design phase is talking about lining up your subject matter experts. And we had actually 3 different subject matter expert groups that were defined, and I'll let Anne talk a little bit more about those.
Okay, so we looked at what we needed to make this successful, and the first thing, of course, was finding someone who was an expert in critical thinking. So we found that person that we thought could do that for us, and we also needed an e-learning developer that we felt we could work with. And we did that, and Global Knowledge were the shining star that we came up with there. We also spent a great deal of time within our own organization identifying what audiences we needed for this training, and we brought in specialists from each of the areas. We brought in specialists from child intervention, family supports for children with disabilities, human resources, administration, and then we just had other people that were interested in the subject, and we also chose our beta testers up front, and we're going to talk more about that later.
Excellent. So as we went through the definition and lining up subject matter experts, we talked a little bit about the whole notion of getting started with the whole design phase. Now, one of the things that's very interesting is that from a design perspective, there has to be a pretty significant alignment with the resources, and that takes place right at the outset of the overall program. Internally at Global Knowledge, I mean, my job as a production manager or project manager is to align the right resources for the right project and get them in contact with the subject matter expert resources as soon as possible. We wanted to open and define an open communication strategy that was critical as we worked at a distance. Ultimately, if you haven't clued into it a little bit by now, it's like right now we talk about Anne being at a distance from us and working with out of the province of Alberta, and she said, good morning. Well, for me, it's good afternoon. I'm actually located in Ottawa. So we actually had the challenge of time and space and distance to deal with. So we wanted to ensure that we were breaking down all the walls that may exist in communication, and we aligned our subject matter experts, our instructional designers, and our development team with the subject matter expert for the content that Anne had lined up on her side. As that went through that stage, we wanted to, at the very first outset, we wanted to validate our course requirements. What were the key success criteria? Some of those were defined at the actual analysis phase, and those were brought into play as we go through this validation, because we're just learning about it at this point in time, whereas Anne's side of the fence has had an opportunity to define all that, their needs from a success perspective. One of the key challenges that we actually had is the critical thinking curriculum that was defined as our base was in a classroom environment, and we were moving it to a monitor-based environment, so a digital solution. Now, what were some of the challenges that were arisen from that? Well, as you can imagine, when you're talking about critical thinking, there were a lot of activities in the classroom that actually take place with a dialogue. They take place with people bringing in situations based on their personal experiences. And when we actually get to the program a little bit later on, we're going to see that one of the key success elements that we worked with in our design stage was targeting all the different audiences. And we had 5 different audiences selected, and making sure that they felt that there was a personal connection between what they did as a job and the practical activities that were being presented to them. So it wasn't just a generic course. So as we go through our design stage, we talk about digging into core materials. We have things such as the content assessment that needs to take place. We're looking at the materials. We're going through all the different elements that are used in class, and our instructional designer is actually looking at those materials and actually creating a full design plan on how those activities that are used in a classroom environment can be ported into a digital environment as seamlessly and as effectively as possible. What we're going to show a little bit later on is some of the scenario-based modeling that really reflects that bridge between the classroom environment and a digital solution, and it really is a bit of an elegant solution to getting people involved in their personal interests into the overall program. So we set up some very interesting communication lines with our instructional designer and the lead content SME. They were expected to just go to each other directly. We didn't want to create any barriers at a management level, so they had the opportunity to talk directly with each other, have a strong sense of understanding, and then move forward in defining the plan. So as we define our plan, there is a requirement from our instructional designer to understand, okay, what are the true content needs? What's the duration? What are the organizational needs? And it goes back to those success criteria that were defined earlier. When we talk about end user needs, not only are we talking about a requirement here to deal with 5 distinct target audiences, we also needed to consider an overall instructional framework that would bridge the wide variety of end user preferences, those who preferred audio, those that preferred imagery on screen, those that preferred different forms of engagement for being involved in the overall program. So we had to take that all into consideration as we put together our as we were defining the plan. So as we move through that stage, our instructional designer is putting together an overall course architecture that defines a series of activities that can be used over and over again, and some activities that are customized based on the specific content and their experience. And as part of that overall process, we actually developed what I like to refer to in this bullet, the when look comes to shove. And this is actually kind of an interesting play on words that I've put together here. And we wanted to ensure that we met the requirements for the branding that needed to take place and the aesthetics that needed to take place to meet Alberta Human Services, AHS's needs inside of their learning management system. At this point, there was actually some pretty significant branding taking place, and we as an organization had already produced one course a few years earlier. It was actually the Suicide Intervention Skills Program, and we wanted to ensure that if the target audience here had seen that previous course, they didn't need to relearn an interface. They didn't need to relearn an engagement arena, so to speak, as they went through the program. It should be intuitive. So what you see here is we've got 3 different screens that were some different options that were provided to Alberta Human Services to give them some different variety as they move forward. When we did our first pitch for the overall program, we actually did use the color branding that existed with the suicide intervention skills because we wanted to have a continuous library. But then we actually got away from that a little bit and offered up some other interfaces that were in a defined palette that existed for Alberta Human Services. And then that allowed us to move forward with a distinct brand for this particular program. And this was really, really important because it allowed us to have a clear understanding between our developers organization, which is us, and Alberta Human Services, to know that we were on the right path aesthetically as well as instructionally. So what we've got as well as one of our key challenges in design was working with the target audience subject matter experts to ensure that there's accuracy. Now, as we went through the entire program, one of the key design activities that took place right at the very beginning was understanding that we needed to bring case studies and scenarios and models in play that directly reflected the 5 different target audiences. Now, how we did that is we coordinated with Alberta Human Services to have sessions take place actually in Alberta with members from each of these different audiences, and we actually had our instructional designer work with them on site to ensure that the tone and the flavor and that the importance of their specific role functions was captured in all the activities that were being developed. And I can't stress how important that is because we did want to have a program that was put together that actually met the needs of all these audiences and gave them a really custom experience as they went through the program so that they could do it in their lives based on what they've seen. So that's through the design stages, and what I want to do now is talk a little bit about the development of the overall program. So what we'll do is, I've got a couple of screen captures here, but we're actually going to, I'm going to bring over a new window. We're going to talk about the program and how it has been laid out. And there's a couple of different things that we'll go through in the overall program itself. So through the magic of digital media, we will, and just wait one moment, slide in the actual program. So Alberta Human Services was working inside of a learning management system called Olay. And what I'd like to do now is actually just have Anne talk a little bit about the Olay interface, and I'll point to certain areas on screen that talk about how we actually put this together, and then we'll actually take a look at some of the different programs inside of the overall course itself and look at some of the different interactive models and get straight to the scenario modeling that was really critical for success for all of the different target audiences.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a bit of a walkthrough. So if you're looking at the screen, you will see on the left-hand side there are a menu, for lack of a better word, and that's actually what it's called. It's called a menu. So the very first piece that you see is Olay, and it says Online Learning Environment. Underneath that, you'll see several little boxes. In there, the learner is able to do things like they have the option to make their own notes. They can put bookmarks into the training as they go through it. They can, if you look at the beginning, it talks about the welcome. That's the very first item on the training underneath the critical thinking and action e-learning. So we give the learner always in our learning management system just a welcome, you're in this course. And then the very next thing that they see is how to use. So for learners who are experienced, they skip over that piece. What that does is it walks them through our learning management system and shows them how to navigate within the system. You'll notice as you go down the critical thinking that we have a Unit 1 with no test. Then we have a Unit 2, and there's a test after. Unit 3 and a test after. Unit 4, test. 5, test. And when we get to the end, the last piece that we have is Unit 6, Squared Away Approach, and Kevin's going to speak to you more about that. Then we have the wrap-up. Then we have a resources section for them, which has printable resources in it, and they can actually print those off and use them, or they can open them up and have them sitting on the bottom of their screen so that they can pop them back up and keep referencing those as they go through the e-learning. And the last thing that we do in our learning management system is have them complete a survey. And they're not able to print off their completion certificate until they've completed the survey. So that's a bit of a quick walkthrough on the Olay.
Excellent. So, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the overall program itself and talk about the breakdown on the instructional design on how it was put together, and allude a little bit to it with regards to the overall structure of the program. But one of the things that we did and we found as we actually went through the production of the overall piece was that we spent about 20% of our development time dealing with the theoretical aspects of the overall program. We started with a general topic. We've got the getting started, and that talks a little bit about at a 1,000-foot level, it talks about the program. It talks about what critical thinking is. We've got a few small pages that really define that at a high level, but then we actually start digging straight into the meat of the theory, and we dig down a little bit further into the other areas. So we start off by creating an environment where we talk about the definitions of critical thinking, and we talk about different activities, and we've created a framework. One of the key things that we did as part of our development is we introduced a guide, which is our speaker, so that it has a personal tone to it. And we also introduced an element from a critical thinking perspective called Squared. And that is this mnemonic that you'll see on the left, or pardon me, on the right-hand side of your screen. We call it the Squared Away Approach, or Squared. Now, one of the reasons why this was introduced is because we needed to create or we worked with the content subject matter expert to have this mnemonic created so that people could remember off the top of their head all the different steps that they needed to go through. So we've got situation synopsis, questions arising, unique factors, assessment, recommendations and rationale, and evaluate reasoning. Now, what was very beneficial is that we used this mnemonic as an anchor through the entire program for the theoretical components as well as the practical activities that took place during the actual program. This mnemonic also, because it was alphabetized, it allowed us to break down the content into manageable pieces so that people weren't being assaulted with all 7 different levels all at the same time. So we go through the overall program, and one of the things that we also wanted to do was ensure that learners were actually engaged throughout the program and that they were being tested as they learned certain things. The second unit, Unit 2, or Your Critical Thinker, is kind of like that 500-foot view. It provides a personal review. It also gives some framework on the overall program. But then we actually jump in and introduce them to an actual relatively fun assessment activity that allows people to test their knowledge on the previous unit's content. This is just a simple little randomized game board that we developed for doing assessments. It allows an individual to go through it, and we'll go through some different activities. We've got some multiple choice questions, and it gives them feedback right away. Now, what was really important, and one of the things that we found, was that during the overall assessment process, we needed to break down our original architecture for the course into more, let's call them digestible chunks. We had some areas that were a little too big, and they didn't allow people to feel confident when they were doing the assessments. So what we have here is actually the final version of the architecture for the course. We did develop it originally, and it had a little bit of a different flavor to it, but this was one of the things that allowed us to ensure that learners were able to look at the materials that were being presented, do their assessment confidently, and feel that they could pass that assessment and then move on to the next segment. So we created these assessments at key intervals to allow people to go through the program and feel comfortable doing it. Now, what we also did is we had to get into very specific elements, and I'm going to go to a different area. We broke down the Squared mnemonic into 3 different unit areas. We've got Part A, which is SQ and U. So we were talking about situational synopsis, questions arising, and unique factors. Then we actually, because those three bundle themselves well together, I'll just show a couple of pages that show some different activity elements. What we also have is this mnemonic and this aesthetic is repeated throughout the entire program so that when people see it, they're actually being refreshed on it on an ongoing basis. Now you'll notice our presentation actually uses the exact same framework for the way it's presented because obviously we wanted to do some bridging here between the two, but it is really a very effective way of presenting a lot of content and providing a visual cue that people can remember things by. Now, each of the units themselves has an assessment as well. We found that by breaking it into the first three letters and then the A, which is a large section, the assessment as a content piece, allowed people to have a higher level of success as they move forward into the overall program itself. Now, we repeated this model through all the different sections of the content and all of the different theory, and you'll notice on the screen here, it looks like there's a lot. We've got Unit 1, Unit 2, all the way through to Unit 5, which talks about the decisions that you make right at the very end. Now, the funny thing is that all of this content that exists in all these areas and all these assessments actually only accounts for about 20% of the overall development time frame and the overall development effort on both our side of the fence as a developer and as well as Anne's side of the fence as a client in developing the content and materials. So what I'm going to jump to right now is actually Unit 6, and this is really, really key to the overall strategy and why this was successful. We mentioned earlier that we had to align different target audience subject matter experts at the outset to ensure that their needs and requirements were met as an audience so that they were positioned for success. The 5 different audiences that were defined as critical groups inside of the overall program were an administrative group, a human resources group, an intervention services group, family support for children with disabilities, and then a generic group that would deal with a lot of the other smaller elements put together. What we ended up doing in this area is we developed case studies and situations that allowed individuals who are taking the training program to actually put all the knowledge that they learned in the theory from Unit 1 all the way through to Unit 5 into play into one cohesive learning activity that actually covered a lot of different decisions and a lot of different points, all based on the specific scenarios that they defined. When our instructional designer actually flew out to Calgary and facilitated these sessions, there was a very significant commitment in time and resources that went into play to develop authentic situations and authentic scenarios so that people felt that there was a tie to their job. We'll walk through one of them right now. We'll just go through the administration stream, and this is actually repeated all 5 times. So we actually got 16 different pages on this as part of their overall activity, but these 16 pages were all repeated 5 different times as well as the different activities that were in them. So so we'll jump straight into here, and we've got a situation. These different situations were all defined during that subject matter expert session. They're all based on real activities, and we talked about the theory before. This is the practical. So we've got this split of 20% of someone's learning takes place in the theory. Now we're seeing 80% of what they're actually doing taking place in their practical activity. What you're probably seeing on your screen right now is what we call our STAR model. So it's storytelling, analysis, results, storytelling, analysis, and results. And it basically is a decision path model that's all based on situations that can grow and develop and have different elements take place. We've got, in this particular story, it's for administration. It deals with a certain situation that someone might have. And we actually go through and we create a lot of color commentary. And that was really, really important to the overall program, is making sure that it was valid and accurate. So we develop a little bit of story, we develop a little bit of color and make it authentic. And then what ends up happening is we want them to take all the knowledge that they learned earlier in the program and place it into a practical component. Here, we're actually asking the learner to pick which of these 3 situational synopses is the most accurate. Now, the interesting thing about creating decision-based models and things that happen in real life is that when you make a decision in real life, someone doesn't come by and basically, unless you're in a very authoritarian environment, doesn't come by and whack you on the thumbs and say, okay, that's the end of it, go back and do it again. Things in real life happen with cause and effect that takes place over a time after that decision is made. What we've done or what we try to do as we develop this type of activity is have one decision that is the preferred decision, one decision that is not the preferred decision, and one that might be a little bit gray, so it's got portions of the correct decision that might take place, and then it also has elements that may not necessarily be the best case. So we've got 3 different situations. I'm the learner. I'm going to pick which one I think is the most accurate, and I picked it, and you'll notice I didn't get a feedback on whether or not I've done it right or wrong. And this is very critical. This is what happens in real life. People actually have situations that explore and develop a little bit more. And then so just like in real life, these situations develop a little bit more. Now we've actually gotten to a point where, okay, there was some interesting things, but there was also some pitfalls. Unlike in real life, you don't necessarily have the opportunity to go back and self-correct all the time, but here it's a safe area. Now, one of the things that actually, for those that had the opportunity to attend the CSTD presentations and the conference that was in Calgary, our keynote speaker basically said the possibility of failure is essential for success. And that's really, really important because that's what this entire model is completely based on. Is like we're allowing people to have the opportunity to make a wrong decision, but they're not going to be punished for it because we want them to see what the outcomes are of that, and then they can self-correct and learn from that activity. So now I can actually go back and pick a different situation. And I can go through the program and I can see that it evolves a little bit more, and it evolves a little bit more, just like it would in real life, and you've got different things that are taking place. And as I go through this, now because I'm at the questions arising, I've actually chosen the correct path. So the correct path in this instance was the second choice. Now, because of the critical thinking model, we want them to go through the same process in that, okay, now we've got 3 different questions that I need to think of. So now we're going through the questions arising elements, and we go through the exact same process with the decision modeling environment, and it allows them to self-correct once again. Now what's very interesting is that it takes quite some time to actually create this level of authenticity to a scenario model and into the environment, and this was actually only one stage of it. Here we found that for the squared away approach, it was very important, and we could leverage this scenario model for the SQ and the U, but for the assessment phase, we needed to go back to a more traditional presentation and activity style. So we actually move into the assessment stage and create a more traditional presentation for those sort of contents on the overall activity, but the situation still takes place. So they go through a number of different elements from an assessment perspective. The story continues to evolve and develop. We've got some other questions and information, and as you can see, this is all specific to that very first element of branching where we went off and did the story for administration. We do even more information because assessment is so big, and then we work our way through it and we find more information. There's different elements where we provide refreshers on different elements with different pop-up elements. And as we go through this program, there's a lot of different elements that take place. What we found as well as we did the development, we actually get to the point where we reintroduce the scenario model again, because the last 3 elements, the R, E, and D elements, do lend themselves to reintroducing the scenario and its decision model once again. So this was just for one stream, and you can see that there's a lot of content and a lot of materials that took place here, and we had to do this 5 different times for 5 different target audiences, and that was one of the key defining success criteria as we went through the entire program. So that really was the meat of the overall program, and that was what really defined the overall success as we moved through the overall development framework. Now, what we're going to do, because we have about 20 minutes left in the overall program, we wanted to get to a couple other areas. Now, this was just, we're talking a little bit about development right now, but if you remember the ADDIE model, we actually have 3 other areas that we're going to talk about here. Now, we talk about implementation, and one of the things that I had mentioned earlier was that we did some beta testing. And the beta testing was very important, and it provided a lot of, it provided some light on the situation on how we actually produced the original component. Now, Anne, can we want to talk a little bit about the different testers and what they were chosen for with regards to the beta testers that were defined?
Absolutely. With rolling out a training like this, we really need buy-in from our users. So we chose testers at the beta testing level that were coming from various areas. We had, obviously, the people that were involved in the critical thinking subject matter. So we needed them to test to make sure that the critical thinking was still valid. We needed our subject matter experts for each of the streams to be involved. So we had that testing group that were just looking at content, basically. Then we had a group that were just there to test things like technical. We had focus from other testers that were, did we meet our learning objectives for each stream? Others were looking at flow. Does the whole critical thinking e-learning flow? Does it start and flow nicely through into the next section, which flows through to the next section, and so on? Then we had people who were there specifically to see if they could get through this e-learning and if they could pass the exams and be successful. We also brought in some learners. Our ministry being so diverse, we have people who are hired for their human services expertise and their ability to deal with people. We have many that don't like and don't want to use computers. So we brought in some of those folks who don't like and don't want to use computers to see if they could get through the training. And again, I can't state strongly enough why that's important to us, because we really need that buy-in by our users. And we needed to make sure that we had objective views from each of those areas, looking at just an area-specific thing. And once we finished that beta testing, they provided all of that feedback back to me, and I sent a very detailed report to Kevin and also to my director and said, I don't want to release this training because the feedback was that we didn't have learner success, that we had given them too much information on each screen. We hadn't been very specific in how we went through our processes. So this is getting into the whole piece that we did on the evaluation. We had 80% of the build was on the scenario-driven practice environment, and the feedback on that was incredible. So we didn't want to touch those streams that we built, and we had wonderful feedback on the STAR model that Kevin had mentioned to you, which is what that vehicle was that we used in that experiential piece. They loved being able to go through and practice that, and it was safe. They could make a mistake, and it didn't cost a child a life. We were able to go through that and read their comments, and it was just, they were relating to what was in that training, because when we had our subject matter experts meet with Global Knowledge's writer, we had those people in the room that had gone through those experiences. So we were able to put those into the e-learning, and that made it real for the learners that were doing the beta testing. The challenges, as I started out saying before, we had too much content in each of the units, and there was too much content on the screen, and the learner success wasn't there. And that was important. Sorry,
yeah,
Kevin,
and actually, I was going to mention, just talking about what some of the precipitators were with regards to that content. So, and did you want me to talk a little bit about the subject matter expert relationship with the instructional designer and whatnot?
Sure, if you'd like.
Okay, so one of the things that is always a challenge from a developer's perspective is that we have instructional designers that have great knowledge in understanding instructional methodology, content, presentation techniques, and whatnot. But the one thing that is very difficult for us as an organization, and for every organization that develops digital solutions, is that we're not necessarily experts in understanding what the content, the core content materials are, and the importance of each of the different messages. And one of the things that is really critical when you're doing development is having an alignment whereby the subject matter expert for the content can assist in clearly, what I like to call it, filtering the forest to find the important trees. Now, for us, as we work through the program, the original program was developed in a classroom environment, and the classroom materials were robust, they were thick, they had lots of information, and I think that one of the things that was overlooked from a content presentation perspective was that not everything that's being presented in the classroom or as part of those materials is actually presented as part of the overall program. The ability to filter out materials became a challenge for this particular program because it was all defined as important materials. And one of the things that we found is that that level of importance of materials wasn't filtered enough as we moved into the beta version of the overall program. Now that was iterated loud and clear from the overall target audience when they went in and did the testing. But the one thing that was interesting is that those materials accounted for possibly about 20% of the overall curriculum. So the adjustments that needed to take place had to take place at a theory level and basically reduce some of any areas that may cause confusion. That relationship, I mean, we as developers rely very heavily on subject matter experts who are brought to work on the program to clearly identify, okay, these pieces, they may not necessarily need to do them. And sometimes it's very difficult for people who are tied to content to say, okay, yeah, this piece of content actually, it's kind of tertiary material. They're not going to need to know that. It's not going to really help them right at the outset, but it's a great resource later on. And so we actually went through and did a program review and adjustment that really only adjusted that 20% of the theoretical content materials. Is that accurate, Anne?
It is. It is.
Okay.
And the important part that we came to the conclusion on at the end of that evaluation was that we needed our learners to know what the tool was and how to use it. So when we decided that we weren't releasing the first version and that we were going to go back and rework it, it was very clear we needed plain language, we needed lots of white space on the screens, and we needed just to have the tool. So we used the mnemonic and we took everything else that was, I believe Kevin calls it tertiary information, and we put it into, and I'm sorry, I'm not seeing the screen Kevin has in front of you.
Sorry.
But, if we wanted a learner to have access to information that would give them additional information, we put it into a did you know or a link or into the resources so that if there were learners that needed more information about critical thinking, they could have it. Or if they needed more about subjects that we were referencing in our core training, but we didn't necessarily enlarge on, the reference materials were there, but not part of the core training. So when we cleaned that all...
Oh, sorry, Ann. What I've done is I've actually pulled up a screen that basically shows some of the elements that we've actually did a bit of a triage on and cleaned out. And we're at the resource section. Things like the common thinking traps, applying intellectual standards to the elements of reasoning, the decision checklists and elements of reasoning, those were all elements that were actually just pulled out and left as resources. Sorry for
initially, they were all on the main screens. And when we went back with the triage framework, I guess, it was plain language, white space, and learner success. Some of our questions were even asking questions that related to things that it wasn't important the learner be tested on that piece, so we eliminated those questions and went strictly to the model, the mnemonic, if you like. So it was important to us that they learn about the model, that they learn how to use it and apply the model, that they do the practice piece and walk away with that ability to make well-reasoned decisions. The practical piece, as Kevin has alluded to already, was don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We had wonderful training in the first build. We just had too much of it in front of the learner, and they were having a challenge getting through it. So if we had slowed down a wee bit on the initial build and thought about, okay, here's some of the things that we know as professionals, but we allowed the subject matter experts to say it was all important, and we didn't do enough of that screening, as Kevin had mentioned. So
yeah, I think
it's
that's
about the users.
Yeah, I think the big thing is organizationally, organizations and content developers need to allow themselves to be a little bit vulnerable to understand that it's like when you do the beta testing, you may get back comments that may have an impact on the overall development of the program and may require some adjustments. There may need to be a reassessment that's necessary, and most of the time that reassessment is actually pretty minor. When we look at the amount of work that went into do the adjustments that needed to take place in that first 20%, it wasn't a significant level of effort. It was a sort of pause, take a look at what was taking place, what were the comments and feedbacks, how can we make that adjustment, and how could we filter the content. And it actually was very enlightening to find out that information from the target audience, because the actual practical activities that they did was very well received. One of the things that was really, really important is like, and every organization has to keep this in mind, is ultimately for success for an overall program when you're rolling it out, it really does need to be about what the user is going to have in front of them to enable them to have success. You don't want to create a program that is beneficial for 20% of your target audience, but then it is confusing for another 80% of it. You want to make sure that you're enabling success, and you want to ensure that you're actually creating learning objects and activities and presentation models that meet both auditory and visual and text-based learners. So there's really big differences that exist in a lot of target audiences, particularly with big organizations. And you also want to make sure that your adjustments want to focus on working smarter than rather just outright speed. A lot of times when it comes down to converting content and materials, it's a reactionary process that takes place. A mandate comes from someone inside of the organization that says, we have to convert this particular program and we need to put it online, and it's got to be done in 5 weeks, and we got to get it done. And that may not necessarily be the best effort against the overall end program, because you're rushing and it's reactionary, and understanding how an audience is going to look at materials and access those materials and be ultimately successful with the learning and training that's being presented as they move forward in their jobs may not jive with what's done in a reactionary environment. So don't necessarily focus on outright speed, and that was one of the things that we learned as we did the development of the overall program. So those are all the things that we wanted to talk about with regards to the development of the program. We went through a lot of life cycle. As you can see, the life cycle of the program started well before the development team, which is my group, was involved. It involved my team. It involved the adjustments that we needed to take place. And one of the things that continues to take place inside of Alberta Human Services is that their audiences that go through this program are monitored and asked for feedback, and they're constantly being, the metrics for transfer of learning are constantly being evaluated. So it isn't a grenade that's had the pin pulled off it and thrown over the fence and here you go, this is the program. This has got a long-term lifespan that's expected to be rolled out inside the department for quite some time. So Sarah, I think we're actually, I'm looking at the time right now, it's 1:55. We have about 5 minutes left, and what we wanted to do is open the floor to any questions about the development life cycle and the process and how we worked on the program. And so we'd like to actually open the floor to any questions right now.
Fantastic. So I just want to remind everyone that we will be sending out a recording of today's session as soon as it is available. I want to encourage everyone to ask their questions using the question pane. If we don't have time to get to your question today, we will send this along to Kevin and Ann and get you an answer to any of your questions. So please keep them coming in. So first of all, the number one, we've had a couple of questions about the program that you used today, Kevin, as your presentation style. Is this something that you custom built to look along the interface with the Alberta Human Services?
Yeah, actually, from a presentation perspective, we actually leverage some of the same internal XML and Flash code. So this is actually it's a Flash object that draws content out of a XML file and presents it with JavaScript. So we're just fortunate that, I mean, I've got a great development team here, and they were able to help me put together this custom presentation.
Oh, great. So I have a question about metrics and measurements that were used to measure if the training was successful. So you mentioned the beta testing. How did you measure what worked, what didn't?
Well, one of the things, go ahead, Ann, sorry.
We used specific questions that we asked of each of the testers, and then that all got rolled up into a summary which both Kevin and I looked at, as well as the rest of the team here from Workforce Development had a review of it as well.
Yeah, what also takes place is that as part of the overall assessment strategy for individuals is they're not expected to basically take the training program and then exist in a vacuum after that. If someone has been taking or is assigned to the critical thinking course, one of the follow-up requirements is through their managers or supervisors to ensure that they're demonstrating the skills as they move forward in their career, and that they're using those skills and they're seeing a defined behavioral change on the job in how they're documenting and managing the decisions that they're making.
Great. So I have a question about approximately how long does it take for a learner to complete this particular training program?
3 hours.
3 hours. And is that all in one sitting, or do you encourage it to?
It doesn't need to be. Our learning management system tracks wherever you're at, as long as you sign out properly. If you are in the middle of a page and you leave to answer a phone call or leave to go into a meeting and you don't close out of the learning management system, it has no way of identifying where you were at. But if you properly close out of the learning management system, it identifies right where you were, and you can open it up later and go back into it. This is also housed on a web-based learning management system, so it's accessible from anywhere, anytime. So as long as they've got web-based access, they can access the training.
Great. So we have time for one more question. A couple of people have asked about scope of the project. Beginning to end, how long does this process take, and how long should people budget if they're looking at implementing an e-learning system like this?
Just for the build part of the e-learning, we spent about 3 months, I believe, Kevin. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, the alpha.
Start to finish.
Yeah, and that was the first version, and then we went in and spent about a month and a half doing the adjustments after that.
Kevin, Ann, I want to thank you so much. What a great presentation today. Everyone, I just want to remind you we will be sending it out, the presentation, and we will get to all of your questions that we weren't able to answer today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today.
You can now disconnect.